Hi, it's Steve with Palladino Power Project, bringing you a video on a topic that comes out periodically, and that is the stride weight setting. And the question is do we keep it fixed at one weight setting, sort of set it and forget it, or do we let it float to whatever the current real weight setting is? And the answer to that, just sort of getting ahead here, the answer is always keep the weight setting fixed. And this video will give you a demonstration of why that is the case. Now, I often say keep the weight setting fixed, but there are edge cases in which case you want to adjust the weight setting, and we'll get into that towards the end of this video. But first, let's go through a little background on why keeping the weight setting fixed is not a problem. And so the key part of the background is understanding that the Stryd algorithm, the way the pod calculates power, is it's natively calculated in watts per kilogram. So at the pod level, what's happening with various sensors, that sensor data goes in, and the power figure is initially natively calculated in watts per kilogram. So you might say, well, okay, why the weight setting then? Well, the weight setting was to allow compliance with watch displays. So it's a multiplier to allow compliance with 3-integer watch displays that default to watts. That's the industry standard. Now, there are some apps that will display watts per kilogram, but the industry standard is 3-integer watts display, so you need a multiplier from what the pod and the algorithm is natively calculating. And so you may be asking, okay, well, wait a minute. How does it calculate? How does the pod out and the algorithm, the Stryd algorithm, calculate in watts per kilogram? How does it do it without knowing the person's weight? Well, this is from Dr. Coggin, and Dr. Coggin wrote this a number of years ago about how the Stryd algorithm natively calculates power in watts per kilogram. First, power is force times speed. Force is mass times acceleration. So when you do some substitution there, ergo, power is mass times acceleration times speed. You substitute the mass times acceleration, which is force, into the first equation, and you get mass times acceleration times speed. And then power divided by mass, you're just moving the variables around. Power divided by mass, watts per kilogram, is acceleration times speed. So you have acceleration and speed, you can figure out watts per kilogram, power divided by mass. So speed is a time integral of acceleration. So all you need is an accelerometer, and Stryd has more than that in terms of sensors, but you need some assumptions in accelerometer, and you have watts per kilogram. So let's get into an example that helps me demonstrate why keeping the weight setting fixed is not a problem. In fact, it's preferred. It eliminates confusion. So let's get into that with a little demonstration. So what I've constructed is several scenarios based on a progression of 20-minute testing over a period of a 24-week training plan, for example. So I've got here in the far left column is the week number in which the 20-minute test is performed, and the result in watts per kilogram, which is natively calculated by the pod. So this is the result, and it's sort of a steady progression from 4.5 watts per kilogram to 4.725 watts per kilogram as the average power for that 20-minute test. That's about a 5% increase over a 24-week plan, which is not atypical. It's certainly possible and a realistic number. Now, the caveats here is that this is a hypothetical example, of course. We're assuming that on all these tests across this period, environmental conditions have stayed the same or pretty stable within a tight range. Wind conditions about the same in all tests. The tests were done in the same location, let's say a track, same surface. The athlete wore the same shoes for all the testing, and the pod was the same pod in the same position on the shoe each time. So we're eliminating all those variables in a hypothetical case, and this is what we're getting. This is the basis. Now, if the weight was fixed, let's say that the athlete was 70 kilograms at the start and kept the weight setting fixed throughout that time, this would be the resultant power. In other words, a multiplier. You multiply 4.5 times 7.0, you get 315 watts, and so on, all the way down. So that also represents a 5% increase in power in terms of watts. And of course, zero change in the weight setting. All right, so that's scenario number one. Scenario number two is that the athlete allows the weight setting to float for each test to whatever the real weight. And it's a scenario in which there's a weight loss. There's 1 kilogram lost every testing period. So, about 1 kilogram every 4 weeks. So weight loss from 70 kilograms to 64 kilograms, it's about a 9% weight loss over a period of 24 weeks. And again, it's all you're doing is a multiplier here because that's what's happening. This was the natively calculated power in terms of watts per kilogram times whatever the weight setting was, which they allowed to float, and this is the resulting power. So you can see in this scenario, even though watts per kilogram were increasing, the fitness level for over 20 minutes was increasing through that 24 weeks, power was decreasing. So that anyway, that's scenario number two. Scenario number three is also an athlete that allows their weight to float. They reset their weight setting, as weight changes, and it's something. It's a scenario in which it isn't just straight weight loss. It's a little bit more bouncing around a usual ideal weight for this particular athlete. And maybe they had some holidays and weight bumped up a couple of kilograms. Then it started dropping down as it got deeper into the training plan. So maybe a 3% loss from beginning to end, but with some bounces in between. Again, it's a multiplier times the same. The athlete had the same progression in 20-minute test outcome, but we're just we're changing the multiplier, and these are the resultant weights. So let's take a look. So this is what it looks like with fixed weight setting. It is a progression. There's R squared is nearly 1, essentially 1. And these are the various power taking those watts per kilogram and using a set fixed weight setting of 70 kilograms. This is the power outcomes, and this is the slope that we see. Compare that to if we just plotted watts per kilogram. The same slope. It's the same slope, same r squared. It's essentially the same thing, because the multiplier was kept stable. So, in other words, when you keep a fixed weight setting, the power is going to track, power in terms of watts is going to track identical to power in terms of watts per kilogram. All right. So now let's go back to fixed weight setting with power in terms of watts. And let's look at that first scenario where there's weight loss. There's 1 kilogram lost every testing period, let's say. And this is what we see. So even though watts per kilogram were increasing, the reported power using the multiplier of the weight, the real weight, was declining. That's not reflective of what's really happening. What's really happening is watts per kilogram. What's happening at what the pod is calculating for that 20-minute test. This is not the same. All right. True, you have a more representative of what the real watts are, but they're confounded because it's a multiplier. What's really happening is this. All right. And then let's look at the last scenario where the athlete was hovering within an ideal weight range, and so it was real weight. It was allowed to float each testing period, and this is the result in watts because of the multiplier changing. And yeah, you're seeing some increase, but the r squared is a lot lower. The slope is also a lot lower than this, which is also the same as this if we use fixed weight setting and are using watts. So if we go back to this original sheet, we'd see that the correlation between your actual watts per kilogram and the reported watts with using a fixed weight setting, the correlation is 1.0. It's perfect correlation. They're the same. When you have this scenario, scenario number 2, which is allow the weight to float and the person's on a weight loss, right? In this scenario, the correlation is pretty good, but it's inverse. Remember that here we have watts per kilogram are increasing over the sequences of tests, while watts is declining. So this is actually an inverse relationship, not good. And even further, we go to this one where the person is hovering within a range, an ideal range, but bouncing around a little bit because their real weight, they're allowing it to float and change for each test session. Correlation between watts and what really happened, the watts per kilogram, is very low. So keep your weight setting fixed. That's the take home, especially when your tracking over time is watts typically. Now I've used WKO, so I could track in watts per kilogram or watts, but if you're using a platform where you're looking at watts over time and you want to compare this race versus the same race last year, if your weight settings change and you're comparing in watts, it's not relative. You've lost that relativity. All right, if you've allowed the weight to float. But if you kept the weight setting the same, then you are essentially you're comparing watts, but it is fixed to whatever the watts per kilogram is by keeping the weight setting fixed. So keep the weight setting fixed. Now, that said, I fibbed a little bit. The algorithm that Stryd uses for the power to overcome running resistance and climbing, PRC, that is natively calculated in watts per kilogram. All right. But in 2019, Stryd added the power to overcome air resistance, which is air power. All right. Stryd air power. They added that. It's not the same algorithm. It's a separate algorithm that's combined with the original algorithm to give you what is the total Stryd power, the total power. All right. So air power, a little bit different in terms of the algorithm to determine the power to overcome air resistance. It's dependent on a number of factors. Wind speed, wind direction, is it tailwind, side crosswind or headwind, runner speed, faster runners, higher power to overcome resistance, air resistance, and runner frontal area, which is determined in the Stryd algorithm by height and weight setting. So these variables here are sort of detected by the pod. This one is a setting that determines Stryd air power, height and weight setting. All right. So weight setting is a variable that determines air power. It is not a variable that determines the larger part of Stryd total power. I'll get to that in a second. That said, height is a far, far greater impact than weight setting. So height, you want to be true to your height. And most adults are not changing their height that much. It's staying about the same. Weight may vary, but it's a very, very small impact to the reported power from air power. So let's get to an example of that. So this component, remember, natively calculated in watts per kilogram. The weight setting is unimportant for the calculation of that power. It's calculated watts per kilogram. The weight setting is merely a multiplier. All right, this one here, a little bit different algorithm that does incorporate both height and weight. So let's look at an example. Let's say the runner did a run, say a 20-minute test run, 300 watts total, right? And it was 3% air power, all right, Stryd air power. That means 97% was this 291 watts. 9 watts were to overcome air resistant air power, right? So remember, variance from height setting is more impactful than weight setting. So as long as you have your height setting fixed and it's correct, you're fine. Weight setting, let's say it's allowed to float, all right? And let's say you have a 10%, or let's say it's fixed. Let's say that example is 70 kilograms. But the athlete's real weight is 77 kilograms, 10% off. Okay? So the real weight is 10% higher than the weight setting. Because the weight setting is such an unimportant factor in determining air power, far less important than height setting. Let's say it's a 10% difference in weight setting accounts for only a 5% difference in this reported air power. All right? That's only 0.45 watts. So in this case, weight setting at 70 kilograms, it's 9 watts. but they're really 77 kilograms. The reported total watts would be 9.45, and this would be 300.45 if weight setting was true. All right. So what I'm trying to say here is with air power, even though it's a little bit different algorithm, it's far less impactful overall compared to the one that's natively calculated in watts per kilogram. And variances of weight setting are very, very minor to this small number anyway. So the bottom line, keep weight setting fixed. All right. So even though if you go really a deep dive and you're talking about the air power part of it, just keep the weight setting fixed, except for edge cases. And I'm not going to go into them in detail, but for my practice, my coaching practice, those edge cases are abrupt environmental conditions changes. Let's say I have an athlete that is at sea level, is coming to altitude for altitude training camp for a couple of weeks. I will adjust the weight setting so it's gives them so they can use their sea level critical power and use that for and the targets are transportable by adjusting the weight setting. Same thing for treadmill. For treadmill use, whether it's motorized or non-motorized, there's a little bit different process here in terms of calculating the weight setting for this versus that. But the CPU is established outside. It's not going to be effective for treadmill use. So I adjust the weight setting to compensate. And then the other one is growing adolescent. Now, think about it. They're growing in height. And so you want the air power. They're also gaining weight. But so with the growing adolescents, I'll periodically will retest at a new weight setting and height setting. Now, does this mean that, let's say you drop 10 kilograms and you want to change the weight setting? Does this mean you shouldn't do or you can't do it? No, of course you can do it. But realize when you change the weight setting, your former power in terms of watts is you can't refer to that anymore. You have to calculate back to what it was in watts per kilogram, and you can compare watts per kilogram after the weight setting to watts per kilogram before the weight setting, but you can't compare watts anymore. And most of the platforms that allow you to track things such as your watts over time, they're displaying it in watts, not watts per kilogram. So yes, you can change your weight setting, but it's best to keep your weight setting fixed. And it doesn't make a difference except for the edge cases. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.